He is a very successful composer, and we have Sidney Corbett in Europe. He is now professor in Mannheim. So he studied in the University of California, bachelor in music and philosophy, then master of composition in the private university, very famous private university, Yale. And he received his Doctor of Musical Arts in composition, also in Yale University. He studied analysis of Varese hyperprism. Then he studied with Georg Ligeti in Hamburg at the Academy of Music. And after such a wonderful time, he began to receive from prestigious institutions very many commissions, from Berliner Philharmoniker, Staatskapelle Berlin, radio station all over, among others. Since 1988, he has lectures and courses at home and abroad. Between 94 and 95, he was visiting professor at Duke University, private University of North Carolina. Since 2006, as I told you, professor for composition at the Musikhochschule Mannheim, among others. He wrote a lot of pieces from chamber music until 6 operas, orchestra works, vocal music, and he is also a member of the Academy of Arts in Berlin. A volume about his work has been published in the series Musikkonzepte in this year, 2022. So wonderful that we have Sidney here. Please, Sidney. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Violeta and I have known each other for a very long time. We're good friends, and I'm very grateful to her and to Professor Liritzis and to everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak to you, and to Mitchell for helping me with the techniques, because I'm a very analog composer, very old school. I work with a pencil and eraser, and especially eraser, and so I'm grateful for the technical support. And as Professor, in the introduction, my presentation will be extremely subjective, and I hope it will be, although I'm a musician, I hope it will be of use to, in some ways, to all of you. That's my hope. I'm going to begin with a text. This is a text by a Chinese philosopher from the 4th century before the Common Era, Chuang Tzu. I'm just going to read it. In my end is my beginning. In the beginning of beginnings was void of void, the nameless. And in the nameless was the one, without body, without form. This one, this being in whom all find power to exist, is the living. From the living comes the formless, the undivided. From the act of this formless comes the existence, each according to its inner principle. This is form. Here body embraces and cherishes spirit. The two work together as one, blending and manifesting their characters, and this is nature. But he who obeys nature returns through form and formless to the living, and in the living joins the unbegun beginning. The joining is sameness. The sameness is void. The void is infinite. The bird opens its beak and sings its note, and then the beak comes together again in silence. So nature and the living meet together in void, like the closing of the bird's beak after its song. Heaven and earth come together in the unbegun, and all its foolishness, all is unknown. All is like the lights of an idiot. All is without mind. To obey is to close the beak and fall into unbeginning. That's an English version by the Trappist monk, Thomas Merton. What I want to try to talk to you today about our preferences, why we decide, as an artist, whether we're a musician or a painter or a sculptor or a writer or a dancer. Essentially, the creative process is the process of making decisions. What do we include? What do we exclude? As a composer, what do I want to hear? What do I not want to hear? And why don't I want to hear certain things? And why do I prefer others? And these preferences, as I call them, are determinative. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about these things in the context of my own work, because that's easiest, of course, but I think that it's possible to extrapolate from what I'm talking about, and possibly it will be helpful to others, regardless of discipline. So, for example, in music, one of the elements obviously is pitch, or scientifically speaking, frequency, right? So there, for about the first, say from 1750 till 1900, we lived in the period of the common practice, which we called it, which is the period of tonal harmony, dominant, tonic, major, and minor. And from 1900, there were other solutions. We had the 12-tone method, which led to serial composition and led to other things later. But even to this day, much, in fact, possibly all pop music in Western culture is still dominated by tonal harmony. So if we, however, want to go beyond those things, like there are people who would say that it's still possible to write compelling tonal music today, and I would agree with them. But I would also say that music which depends on the tonal structure of dominant and tonic, I think it's very hard to create something fresh in that context. So I've, like many of my colleagues, looked for other ways to think about harmony. And melody and harmony are essentially two sides of the same coin, right? So if we're thinking about harmony, and we're thinking about the notes that are available to us on our piano keyboard, which is right here, I may use it later, then these 12 tones are comprised of intervals. And one of the things that I think that is important to think about, and which sometimes is not thought about carefully enough, is the fact that each interval has its own, what I call iconography. The intervals mean something different. And you know, we only have these two ears on our head, and we hear all music with these two ears. And when we hear, say, a major sixth, every major sixth we've ever heard in our life is latently in our mind and is resonating with us when we hear it. And if we decide to use intervals, we, I think, need to find a solution for how to reconcile our yearning for something new with our memory of these intervals and how they interact. And if you don't do that, you do it at your own peril, in my view. So, so as I said, there's, in my view, a kind of an intervallic iconography. And if we understand that, we can use the connotations in our works. So for example, if we're starting with line, let's say we start with the tune A. So if we start with that A, one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, what tones might sound good in that context? What could be the next tone, right? So if I say A, I've chosen the B natural. If we think about music in terms of the cycle of fifths, then by choosing a B natural, I've included a number of pitches, but excluded others. For example, so I can add the fifths on top of that, and we have tones which resonate with those original tones because they're already present according to the overtone series. But I've excluded a number of things as well. So that B flat is, if you're thinking about music from the perspective of the circle of fifths, that B flat is almost unreachable. So we've included two notes, we've excluded many others, because unless we decide to play a cluster, which in that case negates these intervallic relationships. That's also a possibility, of course, which has been widely explored by my teacher, for example, Ligeti and others. But if we decide to use intervals discretely, as I've just tried to show you, if we choose, let's say, an A and a B natural, we include references to maybe an F sharp and to an E, but we make B flat and F very hard to reach if the third note is a C sharp. Now it's clear, right? But if I choose a C, if I go to a minor, then I include other intervals and exclude others. That's a very primitive example to try and show you some things about what consequences our decisions have. And of course, in the context of composition, our thought processes are much more broadly drawn. But I do think that if we are aware of our what's called intervallic memory, then we can use those references, those resonances in our memory creatively. So, and the same is true if you're building chords. And now we'll get to some of the questions of my own personal preferences. For example, as I said before, to me, the idea of a compelling and fresh harmonic approach almost excludes the dominant seventh chord. That's just a chord that just is just been beaten to death in my view. Now, of course, there are other composers like Stockhausen, for example, who the whole harmony of the prelude to Mittwoch, his opera on Wednesday, is just a dominant C7 chord. So I mean, it's a question of personal preference and is not ever really applicable to others. And again, we go back to the question of subjectivity. When I say, even when I say that say A, B excludes B flat, that's also a very subjective thing to say. And there are composers who would disagree with me on that, obviously. But it allows me, though, if I make these decisions, to make other decisions. For example, I'm going to just show you a couple of chords that I like, and I can directly relate that to what I just said before. That's sort of a bright chord, could be used tonally, but it's built upon on certain intervals. And once you have certain kinds of sounds you like, then you learn to live with them and to understand the consequences of them. And that's true linearly and harmonically. And in my case, my idea in terms of intervallic thinking is to try and liberate these intervals that I love from their, to me, too clearly defined syntax. So I enjoy fifths and thirds, but I don't enjoy them when they compel me to a dominant tonic dichotomy, because I just find that lifeless. The same is true, now, of course, there are also many composers who work with microtones, with smaller intervals, and of course, then you have a whole different set of questions about intervals, because they don't anymore in any way respond to the circle of fifths. You can use them, but they require a new syntactic way of thinking. There's a composer who I'm quite friendly with, Manfred Stanke, who spent 40 years thinking about the harmonic consequences of micro-intervallic thinking. So there's that. Also, there are many composers who decide not to use pitches at all. I mean, Lachenmann has given us the Musik concrète instrumentale, which allows us to work with noise and with various shadings of noise. And many young composers I teach are not so interested in pitch. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. But for me, my music is dependent upon harmony. So I think that it's important to think about these things. And one thing I will say as an observer and as an audience member is that I see often composers who don't really think enough about harmony. They don't ask themselves the questions they need to ask. And it's easy to neutralize harmony with clusters and with other techniques. But in a certain sense, I also sometimes feel like composers avoid answering this question. That's my own personal subjective observation. And when we go to the question of rhythm, it's also in certain sense analogous. I studied very carefully the music of the late Middle Ages, and something happened with the Camerata Bardi and the opera when they decided they needed to coordinate. They invented the downbeat and meter, and music was codified into beats. Which is a phenomenal thing. You know, we need to have beats if we want to keep people together. But the music before that, there were no scores. Everything was in parts, and it was possible in the late Middle Ages to divide any attack into 2 or 3, and you had this incredible sort of branching out of lines, and a flexibility and a complexity that's just astonishing, and all using just 2 and 3. And some of it's so difficult to, it's very difficult to even to write in our contemporary notation because of the intense syncopation, because we still think in beats. So in my work, I'm also concerned with trying to sort of reintroduce this flexibility, this branching out rhythmically into music, although notated in the way that we are used to. And one of the ways I do that is I write often in compound meters, that is like a 12/16 bar, for example. Why a 12/16 bar? Because a 12/16 bar, you can have 3 and 2 in the same meter without having to change anything. So you, for example, I'll give you a simple example. So we can, I could say da 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 da, or I could say da 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 da. The 16th is the same, but one of them is a dotted eighth, da 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 da, and the other one is 3/8, da 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 da. And you can use these simple materials to create incredibly complex structures without needing very much more. I can do everything I need with 2 and 3, because what is rhythm? Rhythm describes the distance between events. Essentially, rhythm is described as a silence between musical events. So the rhythm is actually just the part that happens between the attacks. And so, and when we have certain tools we can use to control that. One of them is meter. Like I said, says you can do a 4/4 bar, 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can have a more complex bar like a 12/16. It's the same time, but there's the differentiate. But the subdivisions are such that we can work with these distances between events in a way that allows us to feel different pulses at the same time. And that's, I think, very interesting. So, and again, the other tool we have is the speed, the tempo. So I can go bum, bum. And but it could be, it can be written exactly the same. It's just a question of what the tempo is. So we have tempo and we have the meter, and then of course the actual construction of our rhythms inside the piece. And so with these simple tools, so someone wrote in the I'm really sorry about the first of all, for my piano, it's just atrociously out of tune. It's appalling. I apologize. And it's also, someone wrote about that, and they're right. And the other thing is, yeah, I wrote kind of an E major 7 with a sharp 4, so that's true also. That's not the only chord I use, obviously. You'll see later. Right, so going back to rhythm, so again here, as in the case of harmony, I'm trying to free certain intervals I love from the obligation to respond to tonal dominant tonic harmony, and on the other hand, rhythmically, I'm trying to liberate the rhythms from beats. Of course, we can also talk about sound, and the last thing I want to say before I want to play a bit of, I only have, let's say I started at 5 after, so I have 10 minutes now, right? So the last thing I want to say about this very brief and necessarily only superficial attempt to try and describe some of the ways I think about these things is the most important skill, in my view, that we as musicians need is listening. And what I mean by that is to train our inner ear to hear loudly and clearly in our mind. And that's really true whether you're a composer or a pianist. If you're a pianist and you want to play, let's say, a chord by Debussy, you have to first have experienced it in your inner ear, and then you have to teach our fingers to do it. So the real music is really not the sound, actually. Music is what happens when the sound meets our consciousness. And then the consciousness has this pool of memory and associations, and from that we develop a sense of expectation, which can be either met or contradicted, or can go somewhere else. But the music is actually what happens in that tension pole between memory on the one hand and expectation on the other. And in order to do that, in order to be able to really understand what we mean when we say we want to allow certain sounds and disallow others, is we have to experience them in our inner ear. And that's, I think, the most important thing that we have to do in training ourselves. When I teach, one of the exercises I give is I ask them to close their eyes without a pencil, without a piano, and just hear the music in their head as far as they can. And then when their concentration breaks down, that's fine. Then take a walk, do something else, and an hour later, do it again and try and notice what happened. Did something change in your ear, in your inner ear? What changed and how did it change? And you know, most people can think of like a Beatles song in their head, right? And they can sing the melody, but do they know what mallets Ringo is using on the drums? Do they know what the voicings in the piano were? Do they know what the bass line is exactly? And so if you train your inner ear, I think it makes everything possible. And I think if you don't do that, it won't be possible. Okay, so I'm going to do one more thing, which is there's a poem by Bertolt Brecht, which I find helpful in this context. I couldn't find a good English translation, so I did one this afternoon. So this is my version of a poem called The Zweifler, The Doubter by Bertolt Brecht. The Doubter. Whenever any of us seem to have found the answer to a question, one of us would release the string and the ancient Chinese canvas would unroll, revealing the man sitting on the bench who was so full of doubt. Said he, I doubt whether the work which has consumed your days was worth it, whether what you said, even said poorly, would still be of value to anyone, or whether perhaps you said it well and did not depend upon the veracity of what you said. Is it perhaps too ambiguous, as you bear the responsibility for any erroneous reading? It could also be too obvious and a limit to any contradiction. Is it too clear, too obvious? Then your thing is lifeless. Are you really in the flow of events? Okay, with whatever may come, will you ever be? And who are you? Who are you talking to? To whom is it of use, what you are saying? Oh, and by the way, can it be read sober? Can it be read in the morning? Is it related to what is already there? Are the statements you have made and used at least subject to discourse? Can it all be backed up? Through experience? Through which experience? But above all else, always and ever above all else, how does one act when what you have said is believed? Above all else, how does one act? Thoughtfully, we gazed at the doubting blue man on the screen, looked at each other again, and began anew. So again, I'm really sorry this is such a short version of some of the things I think about. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. I'd like to conclude with a piece of music so you can hear what my music sounds like. This is a piece called Postscript to an Unsent Letter. The idea comes from, in the Vermeer painting, sometimes you'll see women writing love letters and someone looking over their shoulder, or you'll see a lover walking into a room and there's, for example, you can see on the wing of the harpsichord, you know, someone walking in or like in the reflection in the mirror and so on, or in the window. And this also has a personal side. But anyway, this is a piece for piano performed by Florian Heinisch, Postscript to an Unsent Letter. Mitch has the recording and the score, and we'll just listen until Violeta tells me we have to stop, because the piece is about 10 minutes, 9 minutes and 20 seconds. So I don't know if we can listen to the whole thing, but we can hear some of it. Thank you very much. So that's part of this piece. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sidney, very much. I liked the atmosphere and also remaining in the register, in one register, and then you are just longing to feel something else. You just came in the right moment. So thank you very much. Now we shall have the discussion after the next presentation of Niki. Please, Ioannis.
Yes, thank you, Violeta. And thank you, Sidney, for this excellent presentation. Indeed, very subjective. And I hope many questions will arise at the end of this meeting, this colloquium. Now I'm pleased, happy to invite the second speaker of our today's colloquium, Professor Niki Evelpidou, with the title of her speech, Roman Fish Tanks and their Role as Sea Level Indicators. Niki Evelpidou is a professor at the Faculty of Geology and Geoenvironment of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in Greece, and she is also a new member of our academy in Class 4 Natural Sciences. Niki holds 2 PhDs on geomorphology and geoarchaeology at the University of Athens and the University of France-Comte in France, respectively. Professor Evelpidou's research is related to geomorphology, coastal geomorphology, sea level changes, paleogeographic reconstructions, geoarchaeology, the study and modeling of natural hazards, with emphasis on the use of new technologies and innovation. She's actively involved in academic research and educational activities, and she has organized more than 40 educational seminars and training schools, while she has participated in the organization of over 45 national conferences and workshops on national and international interest. Her research production numbers more than 330 publications in scientific conferences and journals, and 35, I think, books and educational textbooks, from which 130 of them, as far as I have counted so far, are peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. She has given many lectures in both in Greece and abroad, in Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, America, Japan, amongst many others, and has been appointed as invited speaker of many conferences and workshops abroad. Niki Evelpidou has received a number of awards and recognitions. Amongst the most significant ones are the 2 awards from the Academy of Athens, in 2013 for work promoting the geological knowledge of the Greek region of Cyclades in the Aegean, and in 3 years ago for her monograph, Sea Level Changes. She has produced also 2 patents and over 90 research projects funded by the European Union and national Greek funds. Niki is very active in production of papers, seminars, postgraduate courses, and European joint projects during the past years. I have the pleasure to invite Niki to get the online floor, please.
Thank you very much for also for the presentation of my work. I will try to share my screen and share sound also. So, good evening, everybody. It's my honor to be here at the Colloquium of Science Meets Arts and Arts Meets Science of the European Academy of Science and Arts, and present part of my research in sea level fluctuations, and specifically the part where geology meets archaeology and vice versa. Many thanks to Professor Liritzis, Dean of Natural Sciences, for his kind invitation, and of course Professor Violeta Dinescu for her enthusiasm during the organization of this event. Since the colloquium is dedicated to science and arts and science, I have selected to share with you my research in an artistic sea level indicator. The music during my talk is composed by a young artist, Mrs. Alexandra Geramutsou. We hope you enjoy. My presentation is about Roman fish tanks and their role as sea level indicator. I will start with few words about sea level fluctuations and why it is important to know sea level stands. Then I will discuss about Roman fish tanks as a part of socioeconomic status of that period, as they provide a portrait of life near Naples, where Rome's elite built their luxurious maritime and urban residences, often adding a fish tank to the architectural design of the property. And finally, I will explain how these constructions of art, evidence of social profile and culture that prevailed in Roman times, are constructions of remarkable engineering, and today they are important sea level indicators. So first of all, let's see what sea level changes are, what causes them, how we study these changes, what happened during the Quaternary and mainly during the Holocene, and how coastal areas have been impacted by sea level changes. Given that all oceans intercommunicate, every sea level change is observable globally. Even though this is a general rule, there are some complex factors that influence the sea level fluctuations. Let's have a look at this sketch, mainly the left part, and if we look at the middle sketch in the left part, we will see a stable sea level. If the sea level rises, the coastline retreats towards the land. A rise in the sea level results in the partial covering of the land with seawater. Whereas, if it falls, coastline moves towards the sea. The fall of the sea level results in the emergence of coastal formations and the advance of the coast. Now let's see the right sketch in order to understand what mean sea level is. As at regular intervals from seconds to months, the sea level fluctuates according to the waves, the tide, the changes in the atmospheric pressure, and the wind. In order to better process data derived from sea level change records, we should distinguish two sea level types, the gauge and the relative one. The gauge sea level is the absolute level of a water surface, which can be measured based on a fixed position, which is not influenced by isostasy and tectonics. The relative sea level is the one we record based on its position in comparison to the land. So, the field data we collect for the study of relative sea level changes during Quaternary, such as Paleocene lines, tidal notches, etc., indicate only the relative level. Between 2000 and 7,000 years before present, the sea level rose rapidly, reaching even 1 meter per century as the ice sheets retreated. After the beginning of the deglaciation, around 17,000 years before present, the sea level rose fast at rates that reached 30 millimeters per year in some areas. The sea level reached its current level about 6,000 years ago. Holocene transgression affected many coasts globally, although there is a great deal of geographical variation in the Holocene sea level record. This is also owed to tectonics and hydroisostatic processes in different areas. The prehistoric man that inhabited the coastal region after 18,000 years or present becomes a witness of cosmogenic changes, since year after year they were flooded because of sea level rise. Here you may see the area of Cyclades 18,000 years ago, when sea level was 120 meters lower than today. Clear that the eastern Cyclades were united into a large island. And just to have an idea how it looks like, the same area, how it looks like today. We may understand how all this affected the humans of that time as the sea level transgression was fast and they could see the sea level flooding their space. An example is how the inhabitants of Naxos dealt with the rise of sea level caused by an earthquake at about 1350 BC. At Ogrota site, the construction of the floor of new rooms was built 10 centimeters higher than the earlier floors. The pebbles placed under the floor of rooms were probably used as a means of drainage, a way of preventing the moisture to penetrate the room. And in this photo is another site in Central Aegean Sea, the site of Magazakia in Paros. You can see that Magazakia area nowadays is submerged. As we have seen from the previous slides, sea level fluctuations often play a significant role in coastal evolution. So let's discuss how we can study Holocene sea level changes. The present-day sea level variations are usually measured by tide gauges or satellites. For studying past sea level changes, it is necessary to find marks left by past sea levels. These indicators may be biological, sedimentological, archaeological for the last few thousand years, and geomorphological. Apart from the obvious evidence of minimum relative sea level rise provided by submerged structures that must have their foundation on dry land, for example houses, frequent archaeological examples refer to structures that may have been parted in the sea and may provide reliable sea level indicators. Although stonefish traps and turtle pens have been reported from many cultures, Roman fish tanks are worth special mention. Roman fish tanks were constructions carefully handcrafted so they could provide the fish with a suitable environment. Within these, fish were either held until distributed to the market, bred for future consumption, or confined to contribute to their owner's tasteful environment. Typically, wealthy families built piers and fish tanks near their coastal mansions. At first, fish farming was linked to religious ceremony as fish symbolized fertility. Later, fish farming became an asset for the rich. However, some fish tanks were also built to provide income to their owner. There are numerous bibliographic references to Roman fish tanks in Italy, where the largest number of preserved remains are found. Along the Tyrrhenian coast of Italy, 54 fish tanks have been recorded, while in the Mediterranean, at least 20 more. Their use indicated the financial strength of the owner combined with the luxurious facilities along the coastline, which allowed him to eat fresh fish during banquets. Fish farming spread with the 1st century before Christ and the 2nd century AD. The Romans indulged in the practice of fish farming and the construction of fish tanks. They give information about the portrait of life near Naples, where Rome's elite built luxurious maritime and urban residences, often adding a fish tank to the architectural design of the property. For the rest of the Mediterranean, Plato mentions that fish farming was practiced along the banks of Nile. The Egyptians constructed large enclosures, which were often incorporated into religious building complexes, royal palaces. Fish farming during Columela's time spread to less robust sectors of Roman society and ceased to be associated only with the wealthy of society. During the first century BC, freshwater fish were considered suitable for the poor, while saltwater fish were more prized and often formed part of the cuisine of the wealthy. This change in taste seems to reflect the Romans' increased desire for luxury, motivated by their exposure to the rich and the culture of the Greek East during the conquest of Eastern Mediterranean in the last 2 centuries BC. The ancient understanding of fish habitats is such that Columella outlines the criteria that would create the right environment for the most common varieties of fish in fish pods. His criteria included choosing the right location and water source, building a system to circulate the water, and designing details that could facilitate the contaminant, vitality, and cultivation of the fish, as well as the aesthetic effect of the owner. Roman fish tanks are found either dug into coastal platforms or partially or fully constructed. Construction is closely related to the morphological features of the coast. The Latin writer Columella in the 1st century AD distinguishes 3 types of fish tanks in which the depth varies. The first type include those which are dug into a stony platform and often consist of some built-up walls and include supply channels starting from the outer limit of the platform. Here we can see the Matonaco fish tank in Italy, and the channels cut in rock that allow salt water to enter into the tank. The second category includes those that are entirely built on the coast. And the third type is similar to the previous one, but shallower because it is intended for a flash feed. The most important characteristics for selecting a fish pod site included geomorphological features, proximity to water sources, and the aesthetic appearance of the site. The construction of artificial fences on rocky surfaces or on surface rock exposures extending seaward is a common design feature of coastal fish tanks. They often used coastal geomorphology and lithology. Also, they used pre-existing coves, hollows, and caves. Finally, the choice of a rocky topography was influenced by the presence of natural hollows and shoals, which provided ready enclosures to confine fish. The placement of fish tanks was largely determined by the need to have access to both salt and fresh water in sufficient quantities to ensure water circulation and the appropriate degree of salinity. Several Latin authors mention the usefulness of mixing salt and fresh water to attract fish into the tank or to reduce salinity during the summer months. For this reason, some channels were used to transport fresh water. In these pictures, we can notice the way they transfer fresh water to the coastal fish tank at Montaza. It is situated in Alexandria, Egypt, to attract fish and also reduce salinity during the summer months. In this particular part of the fish tank, the renewal of seawater from the channels must have been more difficult due to its great distance from them. Freshwater fish tanks became more common not only because fresh water was easier to locate, but because they were simpler to build than their more elaborate coastal counterparts. The construction of small inland reservoirs did not involve the difficulties of forming concrete structures in the open sea or sculpturing rocky geomorphology to create a fish tank. Freshwater reservoirs, in most cases, could be constructed under dry conditions in a watertight environment and then filled with water when the enclosure was complete. One of the main features of the fish tanks is the external protective breakwater built around the perimeter of the tanks, which exceeded their levels. Channels connected the reservoir to the open sea to ensure the renewal of the water. The direction of the channels varies according to the individual morphological and dynamic coastal characteristics of the area, trying to take advantage of the wave energy in order to allow fresh water to pass into the reservoir. Here we can see the outer perimeter breakwater at Montaza Fish Tank in Alexandria, Egypt, protected the tanks from the area's strong waves. And here we may notice channels connecting the reservoir to the open sea to ensure water renewal. We are again at Montaza Fish Tank. The specific day, the sea is calm, but it is not always like that. And here we can see internal channels connecting two tanks in the fish tank. The reservoirs were bounded by walls, above which crepidini remained exposed. In some cases, the lower levels of the paths that were used for maintenance, shellfish cultivations, etc., can be found. Several tanks were connected by sunken arches or by metal mesh. Both of them allowed the passage of water, but not the fish. Metal grids, we call it cataracte, along the channels or between the tanks operated within grooves cut into the bedrock. Imprint can be particularly useful if interpreted correctly in estimating the paleo sea level. All openings in a fish tank should be covered with metal mesh to prevent the escape of fish. Colloquium mentions the use of bronze mesh holes, which prevented the escape of fish, while at the same time contributed to the circulation of water. In this picture, you may notice a bronze mesh with small holes from Crotacea fish tank in Italy, and now we may find this cataracta in the Museum of Santa Marinella. And here you may notice vertical narrow openings from movable grids in Piscina di Luculo. Columella claimed that the fish tank, whether dug into a stony shore or constructed of hydraulic concrete, was designed with channels which allowed salt water to seep into the enclosures. Smaller channels would distribute the water and further ensure adequate circulation within the fish tanks. Based on Columella, the channels were placed on each side of the fish pond below the wall of the enclosure so that the water entered through the openings and manage the circulation, the automatic circulation of the water. They used a lot the tidal range. Fish pots, in many cases, are architectural attempts to standardize and control fishing. The first attempts at organizing fish farming probably began in places where fish were known to congregate. Shelter zones where fresh water discharged into the sea would have been ideal places to trap fish or confine them until they were consumed. The fish, suited to the conditions of the coastal reservoir, had to pass through the narrows of a rock-cut channel, which followed a natural fissure in the headland. At this point, the fish could be trapped and held until collection or transport to tanks within the lagoon. The architecture of Roman fish tanks ensured two main needs. First of all, the fish not escape. Secondly, that the water circulation of the tank was regulated. Here you may notice smaller channels distributed the water within the fish tanks, ensuring its adequate circulation within the structure. This video is again from Montage fish tank from Egypt. While columella suggests a depth of the order of 7 feet, around 2 meters, the remains indicate range varying more than 4 meters. Many fish tanks were divided into smaller tanks, allowing the owner to separate fish by species or age. For this purpose, barriers were placed which could be pulled up or down to allow fish to pass through the connecting channel or opening. The walls that enclosed the fish tank were designed primarily to prevent fish from escaping. Certain species of fish require higher walls due to their ability to jump. Many species of fish are fast swimmers, jumping when distributed or confined to crowded conditions. Other design features which may have prevented fish from escaping were platforms or steps inside the tank. These platforms originally functioned as walkways for the conservators. Such passages, whether cut in rock or formed of concrete, lined the walls of many fish tanks. They were designed to always be above the water level or slightly offset so that they could be used by workers. Additionally, these structures could prevent fish from reaching such a depth near the wall that they could be able to escape the enclosure. Here you may see corridors at Matonara fish tank in Italy, used both to separate individual tanks and as paths for maintenance work. And here you may notice a platform connected to an arch that allowed a better view, while at the same time providing shade for the fish. So, from the above, it is evident that Roman fish tanks has morphological characteristics which are well related to that period in sea level. When certain elements are well preserved and the functioning of the structure is well understood, fish tank remains allowed to estimate the sea level position of about 2,000 years ago with excellent accuracy of the order of 10 centimeters. The channels were used for filling and emptying the basins of water. They can correspond to the mean sea level when they function as sluice gates, but they can also be elevated stable gates, so they should be studied really carefully. In order to study sea level changes, we mainly use corridors, channels, and closing gates. The main sea level indicators are the top of closing gates, the cataracte, generally slightly above the high tide level. The footwalks are narrow passages along the interior tanks. Initially, they were used for maintenance purposes, and they are therefore considered to be above sea level. Then we have crepidiness, usually a lower and higher one exists, that delimit the basin and were used for the maintenance of the structure. The in situ closing gates, which are accurate indexes, are exceptionally rare because of their initial position in the surf zone. The metal grids, the cataracte, as the one we may see in this picture, along the channels or between the tanks, function within groves cut the rock. These grids were placed the tidal range, and therefore their marks can be particularly useful if interpreted correctly for the estimation of paleo sea level. But we have to be very lucky to find one. Otherwise, we can find only their signs left in the rock. And at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention. And in the case you are interested in this research, you may find more info in my YouTube channel, where you can see many more videos from different places with fish tanks I have worked in the past. And now I am at your disposal for any questions that may have arisen.
Thank you, Niki. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Indeed, it met the combination of arts and science with this nice, lovely, relaxing musical cover. It was a very prototype, really. I have not heard before. Usually we hear, a small little period of your music, but you covered very well, and it was well received, I must assure you, at least for me. I would like to ask Violeta to take the lead to ask any, for questions for the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Niki. Very inspiring. And now I would like to invite you to, if you have remarks, questions for Sidney Corbett. I was very impressed by his lecture because he tried to express with words something which is not possible to express. So nobody could really describe what music is. And
I would like to ask something if there is.
Yeah, wonderful. Please.
Yeah, Sidney, I would like to ask you, please, if you could tell us with a few words, in your musical piece that you presented, for example, or your work you're doing, where do you find, how do you define with simple words to us who are not initiated in this, in music generally, the difference between rhythm and harmony in your work?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, one of the things about our preferences, again, is that they change over time. So, and one of the things that I am very aware of are taboos. And for example, for a long time, I had a taboo about major chords, triads. And so this piece is actually put together by superimposing triads. So because when I recognize a taboo, I always want to attack it. So in the case now about the relationship between rhythm and harmony, they're really not thinkable one without the other, because there's no harmony unless it happens in time. And so the way I organize sound in a vertical or a horizontal sense, harmony and melody, is not thinkable without knowing when. We have to know when the thing happens and what it is. And so there's and they part of it's intuition, of course. How do I decide when it's time to change the structure, as Violeta mentioned, when is it time to move to the bass register, for example? Part of it is structural, because I work very carefully with pre-compositional forms and what I would call architecture, possibly because I'm an opera composer as well. I also think about this, sections and pieces as rooms, which I sort of put in certain, which I gave a certain kind of furniture to. I set them in a certain scenic structure. So even instrumental music has a kind of a dramatic sense as well. You know, but these are things that are hard to describe. Violeta mentioned it as well. It's very difficult to talk about music. I mean, Laurie Anderson said talking about music is like dancing about architecture, although I guess you could dance about architecture, but I just think I can try to get close as I can, but there are some new, maybe from a scientific point of view, I do work with numbers. For example, for me, prime numbers are very interesting. Why?
Yes.
Because 8 and 16 are almost always divided into 4 and 8, but a 19, for example, requires me to make a decision. How do I divide 19? And the number itself gives me the resistance I need. Ligeti was always saying, you must always look for the resistance, never take the easy way, always take the hard way. And so if you can find a place to challenge yourself, if you can find structures which provide resistance, then I find that very helpful. I hope I answered your question. I mean, it's a tough question to answer as a musician. I don't really know how to do it otherwise.
Do you follow some numbers like Pythagoras, you know, the Pythagorean theory, you know, or the Platonic numbers, who are called, you know, holy numbers, or
yes,
like 3, 4, 7, etc. In your music, in your tuning, in your composing of music, you know, some fifths, you know, thirds and sevenths, you know, this kind of things.
Well, I mean, there is the ancient Greek music theory, of course, which is based on the monochord, and I know about that. The number 137, for example, is a holy number, also a very important number in mathematics. I use usually simple prime numbers, as I said, in organizing phrases. And with time, you sort of learn what a 23 feels like. You know, it's part of its experience. Because, as I said, and I think it's similar to what I was saying before about harmony and rhythm, is I'm always trying to find ways to liberate myself from the expected structures. You know, like a 4-bar or an 8-bar is just not interesting to me because it's just so predictable. So I use prime numbers to escape that, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Do somebody have another question? So until somebody will.
Mr. Meissner has one. Meinster?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Please.
Yes, I can ask also.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
It was very impressive, both talks, by the way, in their performance. But I have a question in the continuation of our lecture series. Because in the last term, we had a lot of discussions concerning the question of the intervals in music, harmony, and so on. And you know, you are also a philosopher, and you know the gap, the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity is typical for modern times. And since the 17th and 18th century, because in the past, in ancient philosophy, in the Middle Ages, in all cultures, people believed in universal laws, even in harmony and in music and in arts. Ioannis already mentioned the Greek tradition. You know, Euclid, in his famous 5 book, he designed a universal theory of proportions. And that was actually universal from a modern mathematical point of view, because it is equivalent to our modern understanding of the real numbers. And you know, all our engineering, our natural sciences is based on this theory of numbers. And then some of these proportions, geometrical expression of these real numbers, are distinguished. For example, in architecture, the golden section, or the typical harmonies in the Greek and Roman tradition, and then these typical harmonies in the beginning modern times. So my question is concerning your main idea of preferences and selection of preferences. What do you believe as a practitioner in composition? Are there universal harmonies? Are there universal laws as in the ancient time was believed? Or is the modern times right? That means in the end, it depends on subjectivity, not only of cultures, even of different persons.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a tough question. Sorry, Violeta, what, something, did you want to say something? I'm trying to, I'm Professor Meinstock. Well, it's funny, my son, we were talking to him this morning about this, about what, is artificial intelligence music. And it's possible for a computer, there's a guy in Hamburg, Alexander Schubert, who works with these things. It's possible for a computer to put sounds together and remarkable copies of what we know, but the computer can only give us what we feed it, right? And are there universal laws? I mean, of course, we have the physicality of music. We have, we can describe sound, or we can describe music actually as a Fourier transform if we want. We can talk about frequency and volume and so on, and changing over time. But is that music? As I was trying to say before, music really happens in the mind. The sound isn't the music. The music is what happens to us through the music, through the sound, right? That's culturally conditioned. So if we talk to, I'm teaching a Syrian oud player right now, and he has a very different tradition, and his expectations and his resonance and his reservoir of experience is very different than mine. Of course, we have the physical properties of sound, the overtone series, and the spectrum of noise and other things that contribute to what we hear. And those are, of course, physical facts. Those are questions of physics. But you're asking about music, and music is primarily, I would argue, subjective. So if I were to say, for example, that I've discovered some sort of immutable, eternal harmony, that would be to me an incredible sin of arrogance, because my perception of music is very strongly culturally limited. I mean, I come from a particular cultural situation with my certain experiences, which are necessarily part of how I perceive everything, right? So I can say for me that I've discovered certain things about the way sounds interact and certain harmonies work in certain ways, and certain unspeakable internal content, spiritual content, I would say, is.
May I ask a simple question? May I try to simplify this? I have a simple question.
Okay, please.
What does it take for two people to say that they like the same piece of music? How much time should they spend studying it? And you, Mr. Corbett, for example, if you have a colleague that you have both spent time together studying and working in music, what does it take for you to say, I like this, and to agree between you?
Oh, that happens often, thank heavens. And sometimes we both, depending on who the people are, we also agree to dislike something. That's also possible. What does it take? Some of it takes experience, but I would argue also that a certain openness is necessary, allowing the music to reach you. I don't think it's necessary to have a musical background, a musical training. I would say that it's helpful sometimes, although we also have people who are tortured and maybe unlearn experiencing beauty because of their training. The déformation professionnelle, I can still cry even at a bad performance of the last movement of the Mahler Ninth Symphony. I will still always cry, and I'm grateful for that. That I still can be reached by it, and so I would say open your ears. That's all you need.
Without experience.
With or without.
But if you know about Diana Deutsch, who made researches and this demonstrated that, for example, we speak about an interval and we are feeling something, but everybody feels something else. So we are not corresponding 100%. It's a very interesting for psychological researchers. But that's me. And Diana Deutsch worked for this research very many years.
Yes, it's very interesting. I know some of the research, and I feel like I'm not really qualified to answer the question in some ways. I can only really, music is so personal to me, you know, and I respond to so many different kinds of music so deeply. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We wish you success in your work, Sidney. And
Thank
come
you
again.
so much for your patience in listening to me. I hope it was helpful to some degree. Thank you very much.
Ioannis, you have the floor now.
It was very helpful, and very philosophical. It triggered, you know, at least me, you know, in several strings of my inner self, of what you said and how you presented. After all, it's a personal matter, you know, music. I would like now to ask anyone who would like to have any question about the second presentation of fish tongues and by Niki. Is there any question?
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, Professor Boutis, yes.
Niki, Mrs. Evelpidou. Niki, what have your findings and research and fish tanks and sea level told you about the evolution of sea level over the ages? Can you compare them to what other people have done by different methods? Do you find some agreement between other estimates of sea levels over the ages to your own?
Very nice question, and thank you for asking that, because you give me the opportunity to say a few things that I didn't mention in my presentation. In fact, when we study sea level fluctuations, we don't use only one sea level indicator. We compare. And we use as many as the nature can give us. So one type of sea level indicators are the archaeological, like fish tanks. We love fish tanks because they give a great accuracy of the sea level stand. And also we know the time period, we don't have to date. But we use at the same time other different kind of techniques. For example, we drill a lot in the coastal lagoons in order to reconstruct the paleogeographical evolution, if there are lagoons. If there are not lagoons and the area is rocky, then we are looking for imprints in the rock of sea level stands, like tidal notches and platforms and things like that. We use also in areas where we may have beach rocks, we use beach rocks, which is fossilized beaches. And so we compare as many as possible in order to be accurate, because sea level changes not only because of static, but we have also tectonic reasons and other.
And what kind of time span can you cover? Can you go back 1,000 years, a few thousand years?
Yes. In fact, depending on the method, we may go back to 20,000 years before present. Of course, in case we are using archaeological indicators, it's only for a few thousand years. But other type of indicators, for example, the sedimentary through the drillings in the lagoons, we may go back to 20,000 years. And we may use also indicators not only in the land, but also underwater. For example, we use a lot tidal notches, which are imprints in the rocky cliffs of submerged rocky cliffs, and that have been eroded because of bioerosion and from animals living at the tidal range. So it is also an accurate method.
May I continue with a short question? The sea level. For us modern people, sea level is nowadays correlated with ecological questions and changing danger of ecology, things like that. So my simple question is, was there a kind of awareness in antiquity, in Roman times, for this kind of correlation, that the change of sea level may have something to do with dangerous situations of nature in general?
Exactly, a wonderful question, exactly. And we can see this in the sediments, in the sedimentary columns. When we go back in time, we can see these changes. We can see species that are dying because the environment was changing, and other species were coming. It's very clear, and it is a very good example in order to understand what is coming. When you go back, when you study the past, then you have a clear idea of what is coming in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Must.
Any question? No? Okay, Violeta, we have to
Thank you very much.
close, I think. Thank you, both speakers. Thank you, the participants. It was a very nice evening, I think, and productive and fruitful. Gave us a lot of ideas, to work later or to look, through information from our books and our internet. And I'm looking forward to the next meeting in 2 weeks' time. You will receive, all of you, on time, a link that you can join us with 2 different, lectures. And thank you very much, Mr. President, for your presence always, even though the internet is not working or there are so many other problems there, but you managed to be present. And it's very encouraging, of course, for a president in academy to be present in a series of colloquia, because we know that the hierarchy is more busy than others, administratively and not only. So I do appreciate that, myself and Violeta, for your steady support, and we are looking forward to see all of you and more in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk, Niki. It was great. I put the books I read from in the chat if you want to see them.
Thank you.
Okay. And the talks and the summaries are already uploaded in the website of our academy. Not only these ones, but also all the past ones. So everything is recorded as a type of documentation of what we have done.
To be together is something special. Thank you very much.